Well, welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
This is episode 6, and it's going to be called The Enlightened, not the Enlightenment. We'll come to that. We're talking about sort of 1650 to 1800.
Yeah.
You're planning 2 more programs to take us up to the modern day,
Yeah.
Which I'm very excited about. So this week, we always reflect a little bit where we left things. I think we've already had a discussion that we both found the humanists quite tough.
Yeah.
And that's just because I think it's to do with where we get the balance on where things are with the idea of the teacher. Or possibly we exhausted ourselves with the 50-minute programme on the medievals that we didn't have anything left in the tank. I don't know.
Yeah.
But can I just run a few things past you about last week's programme before we press on?
Yeah.
And we were you kind of left things with Bacon.
Yeah.
You talked about the advancement of learning, the attack on Aristotle, a sense of reduction, but some kind of positive things. He calls out the excesses of the reinterpretation of the classics. You can't take anything for granted is something that you say. But you also say that his attack on the syllogism was not probably as good as he thought. We all used logical reasoning. But then you sidestepped again and said, but no, there's still quite a few things we can take from Bacon, and especially going into this, bridging into this next period of the Enlightened or the Enlightenment. That is a massive question, but hopefully it gives you something to respond to.
Yeah, I think, and probably it will come up more when we look at Locke, who takes some of Bacon's attack on the syllogism further, and Locke admits, I might as well mention it now. Locke admits that I readily own, this is in his essay on human understanding, that all right reasoning may be reduced to his forms of syllogism, but yet I think without any diminution to him I may truly say that they are not the only nor the best way of reasoning for the leading of those into truth who are willing to find it and desire to make the best use they may of their reason for the attainment of knowledge. So, I mean, and that's, pushing on a bit from Bacon and really saying, I understand that syllogistic reasoning, deductive reasoning has its place, can give you a certain statement of fact and truth, and yet somehow is not the same as working with knowledge as it is in front of you. And I think there is a great educational writer, although one of the things I've noticed is I'm not using educational texts as such, or the mediation of educational texts. But Bantock, in his 2-volume study of the history of educational thinking, he says that essentially there's a shift from in the humanist period and the Renaissance from words to, in the Enlightenment period, things. And that's what becomes not just knowledge, but what teaches us. And that's why Bacon's development of inductive versus deductive reasoning is so important. It does allow you, in a sense, to break away from the dogma that you may have inherited. It means that you can't be as clear as as you were perhaps in the syllogistic sense of whether your truth statements make sense just in and of themselves. But you're opening up a whole new ocean, as Newton put it, of the world in front of you for you to kind of integrate with. But perhaps you're denying the potential of the universal knowledge that the Middle Ages or the medievals had, and therefore again you gain and you lose. But I think it's like you do offer the potential for enlightenment to emerge, and in this period really you assume that not only that you not needing to get out of the cave, of Plato's cave, you're kind of saying there isn't a cave, which is a really, really fundamental point for a teacher to consider, because you might not need a teacher.
Whoa. That's a ticking time bomb. Perhaps we can pick that up over the next 2 discussions as well.
Yeah.
Today, the Enlightenment, no, because you like changing titles. The Enlightened, Where are we going to start?
Well, in order to get to that, I just want to refresh where we did finish last week, because I do agree with you, it's so complicated. But I've got about 5 things that came out.
Yep.
One of them was this thing about sophism that we discussed. It came up again, and I went back to one of the great texts on sophism, Plato's Gorgias, where there's a discussion of many interesting things about whether the orator or the teacher is kind of relativist. And they say that Socrates says in this, so is oratory a producer of conviction persuasion or teaching persuasion in the discussion of justice? And he seems to be saying that oratory does involve a kind of trixier, showing off element rather than actually driving at the truth. Now I think there is, in the discussion of sophism and mannerism and Castiglione's Book of the Courtier in the Renaissance period, there is the potential for artifice to be turned too far the other way, away from nature. So if you remember in Castiglione, artifice is a way of making you more natural. You need to learn something, you need to put on the shell of knowledge. I like that idea. I like the idea that civilization, as taught to us, is something we have to inhabit. But there is a kind of sense that it's not always completely a drive at the truth, or that artifice becomes a goal in and of itself. So I think one of the things that comes out of the Renaissance is that idea, but that also there is actually then a Western tradition itself to engage with. And another point is that tradition is not just the classics, it is the Hebrew period. So it's important that we say that from the Renaissance and the work of Ficino, for example, he wasn't just saying, I'm going back to the classics. He was trying to reintegrate the 2 sources of the Western tradition. And I think that, again, is worth considering, because the teacher is then obliged to respond to that, I think. Of course, in today's session, we're going to see that the teacher in many ways can reject that tradition and just say, I want to work with nature as it is. Another point is vernacular language versus Latin, which again is very strong in the Renaissance period. But Newton, for example, brings it back while writing in Latin. But you get the sense that if you're writing in the vernacular, say as Dante did, you're trying to teach a different kind of person, someone who's got a different beginning point. So again, it's worth pointing out. And then within that, Virgil. Virgil, we mentioned briefly with Dante in a mentoring sense, but again, having thought about it, Virgil seems to be everywhere. He's used by Copernicus, we may mention today, on the way to Newton, and you wouldn't expect it. And again, it's like Virgil is somehow this bridging teacher between the Roman or the classical period and the Renaissance and moving on towards today. I just find his role perhaps is something we need to always consider more of. And then I think I did mention this last week, but the idea of the teacher, say Ficino, outside of a university setting seems to be quite a dynamic influence on the development of the teacher when you consider that Florence didn't have a university as such. So again, that's interesting. Do you need an institutional setting? Well, I think in some ways the Enlightenment or the Enlightened period today is going to show that, again, they were reacting against what they perceived to be the legacy of medieval scholasticism and trying to say we've got to do things differently. Again, there's something really, really progressive in that, and something that can perhaps be useful. And then when we get to Descartes today, you're going to see that he ends up doubting all of his teachers. So I do think when we get into this, it is a question of what is the teacher for? The Enlightenment in some ways is it's a defence of knowledge, the advancement of learning, if you like, with which Bacon begins, although you could argue he's a little bit before this period. But in some way, the teacher is on the back foot, and they've got to do some pretty sharp thinking to work out how they're going to go forward. And you see a range of different words coming up for teacher, which again I think is worth, it's not something can be passed over easily.
Thank you. I mean, that really does actually sum up quite a few of the themes over more than one last week's session.
Yeah.
So going back to where you want to start today, would you like to introduce who we're starting?
Yeah. So I mentioned Bacon, and again I see Bacon as transitional. There's one man who doesn't come up a lot, but he's definitely transitional to what is. If you reject the idea of the teacher, but you don't reject knowledge, well, what are you going to come up with? Well, it is kind of the textbook idea or the mechanics of teaching or method. And although Bacon suggests that, it doesn't really go as far as the person I'm going to mention, which is Ramus, as the Americans, I believe, call him, and we may say Ramus. Peter Ramus, 1515 to 72. Essentially, again attacks Aristotle, doesn't necessarily come up with a particularly strong vision, but he's working in universities in France, I think, and he is essentially turning knowledge into a diagram. He's stripping away everything, and he writes these very, very controlled lectures where he says things like "Holy Jupiter," almost as if he thinks that will work. And I think, for a while, what he was doing did make him very, very popular. But he ended up, I'm sorry to say, with his head cut off in 1572. But I don't think that was necessarily about his teaching. But he certainly began this kind of transformation in teaching that I think the Enlightened period or Enlightenment period does take forward, where you do see that when you say you're going to defend knowledge, you start to think, do I need the teacher? I think perhaps what we've established in previous lessons is that the teacher's got something about them, a bit of personality, a bit of charisma maybe. Ramus seems to really take that away, and I think, as I've put it in my notes, pedagogy, what works pedagogically will take over from intellectual integrity. And I do think it's an attack on the teacher. So you move away from the exploration of the just and unjust, say, in a really uncomfortable way, which is when you see really great teaching, to just saying, is this knowledge teachable? I think you're beginning there to get what you get today in schools, which is this knowledge grid approach. And you feel like, yeah, everything's there, and yet nothing's there. There's something missing about what is trying to happen between teacher and student, and you end up with didactic in and of itself. Not you don't say, well, there's a role for didactic teaching, you need to know this, but didactic itself becomes turned into a method. And there's a great book on Ramus by a man called Ong, O-N-G, and he says essentially teaching becomes diagrammatic and de-rhetoricized. You take away the personality of the teacher. Speech is no longer where the human mind lives. It's imprisoned within private space alone. And then you lose everything. You lose scholastic disputation, which again in the medieval period could be so exciting. And you also lose Socratic debate. And you end up creating a kind of monologue. And therefore you end up with procedure, not abstract thought. Now, although Ramus came to a tragic end, I think his role, if we consider today's approach to teaching, is very significant. And it would be, it would be worth revisiting that man to see why he did this, or came up so early with this methodized approach that I think ends up destroying the idea of the teacher. But I think his legacy is there for all of us to see today. And it's a cautionary word from our point of view, I think, in these sessions, to say there's got to be more than that, because one thing I've found is I haven't really gone to the teaching literature or the educational literature as such. I have, as you've pointed out, gone to what I consider to be the great texts. And I feel like they're trying to teach me. So I've got to go there, and they're not easy. Dante or Milton I found still really, really hard text to understand. But it's that lack of ease that makes me think they've got something to teach me that is universal or that I've got to grapple with. Ramus seems to take that away, and it does concern me that we sometimes try and do that too much today in newer schools, some of the new academies, and teaching methods in general, online. Something's missing, I think.
Oh my goodness. So those people that have been watching so far, probably might have been thinking about, can I really stay with this series, have now just been confirmed of all their suspicions that this man has said, if it's hard, it's good.
Yeah.
If the texts are hard or difficult, it's good.
Yeah.
You've put yourself in a corner there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think when I was a kid myself and no one was teaching me Plato or Aristotle, somehow I knew, and don't ask me why I knew, that when I heard those words, I had to try and find them. It just took me a long time to find the teacher or the books to do it myself. And yes, one of the things about being a teacher is that you've got to confront the fact that you don't know things, and you're either looking for the teacher that's going to get you there or show you a way to get there. But that teacher will say, these ideas are difficult, they're waiting for you. I've engaged with them. Take what you can from that, and then you pass it on. That's pass the tradition on, see what you can do with it. But yeah, I think some books, some teachers have earned the right for us to be saying they're always going to be there for us and they're always going to give us different things. That's a tradition that really counts.
What is more, you're convinced you're right.
Well, as we said at the start today, conviction, persuasion, or teaching persuasion, I am convinced I'm right, yes. It doesn't mean I don't want to be taught other things about how nature works, but I think, yeah, the seriously big questions do go beyond something like the textbook style. And yes, it's something over and above, maybe even the curriculum, which is something I really would defend, a great academic curriculum. But you find the Ramus style approach at all times. So what is it that makes a teacher say to another teacher, yeah, what do you mean with that? Where are you going with that bit of the curriculum? Or just your current fad on method, which seems it's often a form of learned response you're trying to get from a student, not a genuinely shared exploration of the knowledge. Yeah, I haven't got the answer, but yes, I'm convinced I'm right.
I don't want to slow you down, and I know I'm being slightly playful, but you did throw a grenade on the way towards knowledge grids.
I did, yes.
And I can't...
You like them, don't you?
Well, they've served a purpose.
There you go. What purpose?
Okay, all right.
Well, no, I think the idea of, yes, universal knowledge that you restrict and reduce to a simplified form, very, very good. But I think when I first started teaching, the two words that I found useful were which bit is abstract, which bit's concrete, and I kind of accept that as a framework. And it then used to spin out in any way in my curriculum planning. But I felt the teacher shouldn't just say, in the kind of lesson planning way that we probably both grew up with, you know, aim, objective, some kids will know this, outcome this. And I felt that knowledge grids, although they seem to be a little bit above that, they kind of just do the same thing. But I'm not against saying, right, this is the essential knowledge. You must know this. I want teachers to do that. I always worry, though, that when you get that approach, someone's trying to take a shortcut. And if that's the teacher, it worries me. Or if they're trying to take a shortcut, take the shortcut, but show me where you're doing your wider reading to make sure you can come through that in some way and make it all come together. But, you know, perhaps I'm being too hard on knowledge grids.
Thank you. We'll come back to this.
Yeah, I hope so.
So Ramus, he's responsible for knowledge grids. Who else have we got in the mix?
Right. So I think we've got to consider Descartes. You know, he says, "I think, therefore I am." If you remember when we started, we had Yahweh, Jehovah, or God saying, you know, "I am that I am." You then get Descartes in his discourse on method. "I think, therefore I am," because he doubts everything. Again, he's kind of doubting all his teachers. He says, you know, I've given up really taking from anything except the book of the world. You get this very romantic idea. And I don't think he's as clear as people think when you get the Cartesian method. But he's, in doubting everything, of course, he then comes up with what he's certain about. But I think the key thing is, he was taught by the Jesuits at La Flèche, a school in France. And apparently it was, as we've just discussed, a really rigorous curriculum, which I would defend, Catholic or not. Okay, it was Catholic, but they believed in what knowledge was. It gave him a great grounding. He then proceeds to doubt it. I think that's fair enough. Anyone that's been taught well can go and doubt it. But what I question is it's a more inward turn than we think. Although he is opening things up in some ways to say, he's putting flesh on the bones of what Bacon said, is that he's allowing us to say, the I, can now explore the world and work out what it is they know mathematically or scientifically. And that obviously is a tremendous step forward. Plato said mathematics is important, but he didn't really use it to quantify the world. And I think Descartes is beginning to do that in this. But again, maybe one quote, because I can sense I'm getting too involved in all this already. Those who set themselves to give precepts must regard themselves, and precept, by the way, is a word that comes up to kind of say you're not being, it's kind of teacher, but not really, must of course think that they've got greater skill than those to whom they prescribe. And if they err in the slightest particular, they subject themselves to censure. But as this tract is put forth merely as history or a tale with some examples of imitation, and there will be many more examples to follow, I hope it will be useful to you. And again, usefulness, as opposed to a kind of you need to know, is again what's driving this enlightened period. He's not sure, and therefore knowledge loses its privileged status in order to be rediscovered through science. And again, Locke does this as well with his ideas of what's useful. So I had, again, quote from Descartes, I had always a desire to know how to distinguish the true from the false in order to get the right path in life. I rejected as false all the reasonings I had hitherto taken for demonstrations. And finally, when I considered what we experience when we are asleep, none of them are true. I don't think he goes as much further than that, really. But what he says is, we've got a basis in the mind, I think, therefore I am, to say that what's outside the mind not only cannot be trusted, but can then be rediscovered. That's progressive. But I think some of his sort of foundational ideas, he believes still in innate ideas of God, for example, are not really very well explained. And in some ways, I worry that Descartes ends up with too subjective approach. And even the word subjective, I think today people say, oh, he's being subjective as opposed to objective. But subjectivity is a great word. It gives you control or agency, which is very much about the Enlightened period. But subjective and objective in themselves can stop thinking. It's a way of just labelling. And I worry that it kind of just leads in a way to a bit of, a bit more conviction, persuasion than teaching persuasion. I'm not as convinced by Cartesianism as I wanted to be when I first started this. And I've always found Descartes a bit tricky in that regard, though I can sense something modern is breaking out in what he does. And I love the idea of I think, therefore I am. But when I first read I am, therefore I am, I thought that's something more powerful in that. Obviously, that's God. So again, it's how you find that balance between the two. And I think the teacher perhaps could gain from considering what Descartes is gaining himself when he doubts. But it's definitely tricky.
Thank you. After Descartes?
Yeah. I think we've got Milton. Milton's Paradise Lost. It's a wonderful book. I know you like it yourself. Milton doesn't really write on education, but he does have, one or two references to teachers. He kind of says, wolves, or this is a quote, wolves shall succeed for teachers, grievous wolves. When you think you've learned everything and you've taught it and passed it on, it will be attacked. This is his message. Although he, gives an account of Satan trying to deceive Eve and take her to the tree of knowledge, and he thinks that that's right and discusses it though. And again, in a way we've seen before, the snake rises up dressed like an orator from Athens, and to make sure he can explain causes to her. And then, of course, she then takes the fruit from the tree, and then it goes. The world is destroyed again, as it were. I just think Milton's very interesting because he did write separately on education and said, you know, that we should learn grammar, learn to speak like an Italian in order to get rid of the English tendency not to open your mouths enough to grace a southern tongue. Very, very good point to make. So that bit of what Milton's doing is good and quite interesting on education itself. And he does seem to be aware that knowledge is something you can play around with. I think you just gain from reading Milton because he's very expansive about what's happened. And I suppose in the middle of the Enlightenment period, he's a kind of reversion to the classics as well. He's got that classical style, which is a kind of contrast to the inductiveness that we've been talking about. So I think Milton's worth, again, a difficult author. You feel like there's more there than you're ever going to know. And I feel like he's there, he's teaching me. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Then probably driving this again is Newton. So Newton, as you know, said, you know, I consider myself to have been standing on the shoulders of giants, publishes the Principia in 1682, and it's an attack on Descartes. And it's very, very interesting, Newton, because he's famously got the quote where he considers himself throwing pebbles at the ocean of knowledge to try and, or picking up pebbles on the ocean or the beach of knowledge, or whatever it is, to try and understand something about the world, the book of the world. But his actual book, the Principia, I think is much more didactic and teacher-centered than people think. He uses this, you know, he uses definitions, he uses scholium, which is a kind of discussion of the knowledge he's taught, and the idea of a lemma, a sort of clarification or intermediate step. And in the lemma, he often says, you know, if this is accepted, I say that this must be the next. He's very clear, and he does say this, if I take in the section definition and 8, I must observe that the vulgar conceive quantities under no other notions but from the relation they bear to sensible objects, and this leads to prejudices. In order to remove those prejudices, I will distinguish absolute and relative, true and apparent, mathematical and common, in order to then explain or re-explain time, space, and the laws of motion. I just think this is a very classically driven text. It doesn't matter, that in itself doesn't matter, but if you accept that Newton is the basis of what became modern science in terms of those laws, he's very teacher-centered and didactic in his style, and he obviously feels he's got to clarify. And so what's the message? If you're going to teach in an abstract way, you better really, really clarify each point. And it's essentially a treatise on knowledge that obviously achieved incredible things. It's nothing like Bacon, though. It's all, you know, it really towers above that in terms of what he's trying to do, and I think then set the ground for the way that modern physics and science developed.
So, Mark, just picking up there, you wanted to look at who sort of preceded Newton.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Robert Grosseteste, who's important.
Yeah, Grosseteste is interesting because he's the one that I think is a great example to what Newton did. He was at Oxford 1153. Oh, he was born 1175 to 1253, and essentially he was working with, or chose to work with, light, or to choose the idea of light as his focus point. It's like he went off theological topic. Like a lot of great teachers, he goes off the point. I think that's what he gives us, because without him doing that, we probably wouldn't have come up with mathematical physics in the way that we had then ended up with Newton. So I think Grosseteste is worth pointing to, just because he sets that sort of style, whereby when I say light, what I mean is he's choosing to focus on light and not God. And that itself is something that then, you know, you would say could end up with optics. But as a teacher, he wanted to verify. And I don't know what it was, but it's like we see again and again that teachers in what we've studied, they break away from the preconceived book of knowledge they've been told to teach, and something is rattling around in their head to say, I need to go there. And I think Grosseteste did that. And in many, many ways, by setting up mathematical physics in that way, you do end up with Newton and his studies of light. So Grosseteste to me is an interesting precursor, and again it messes around with all our historical concepts. I and I like him for that reason. And then you get, of course, following him, Copernicus, also technically a Renaissance figure, although he didn't have the evidence that Galileo later had. And I really like what he said, because he again uses Virgil. Was Virgil his teacher? He says, "For how is the wind in the air different from the current in the sea?" You can see he's thinking sort of analogically, and that seems to be important. But he directly quotes Virgil. Where does he get this idea? We sail out of the harbour, and the land and the cities move away. As a matter of fact, when a ship floats on a tranquil sea, all the things outside seem to the voyagers to be moving in a movement which is in their own image, contrary to what's at rest. So he seems to imply that you can bridge teaching you by the classical period or Virgil and where you're trying to get to, and that you do need that sense of an idea to drive you forward. And again, I think Copernicus is interesting because of what he ended up contributing without his evidence. Something in his mind was allowing him to teach us that the world could not be as it looked. And again, I think that with gross test allows us to set up where Newton went to. But in any session on the Enlightened, you've got to go to Rousseau. So I'm kind of bringing a few things together here, because Rousseau or Kant had specifically said what is enlightenment, and said it's to liberate yourself from self-imposed tutelage, a teacher in you that stops you learning. And I think Rousseau goes further than this, and with his Emile. And again, we've studied the Emile. Emile's an imaginary child taught by a tutor who is called Jean-Jacques, who is Rousseau, and ends up being very manipulated. And again, what Rousseau's essential point in the book is, teach the child that they don't need a teacher except you. And it brings back this point that you are manipulating a child. And I do worry about this in modern education. The idea that you kind of manipulate the child to get the learned response that you want, rather than a genuinely shared discussion about knowledge. And I think one of the great sections in this book is the child is told to plant some beans on a piece of land, but not told that the land is owned by a gardener. The gardener then says, "Why you planted them on my land?" And the child has to learn that what he thought was his own seeds was actually on someone else's land. And this creates the conflict in the mind about what is the morality of the situation. And Rousseau completely engineers this in the book, and thinks that that is I believe, a great way to teach the child. And then in another section makes the child cry by putting them in a locked room. This is in some of what he says is a response to Locke, who had also written about education, saying that he didn't like what Locke said, although in many ways what they're both getting at is an idea of knowledge that is useful. And again, it's natural knowledge. It's still this idea of what is natural. It's not like Newton's science at all. He said, this is Rousseau, master to child, don't do that. Why not? Because it's bad. Bad? What's bad? Well, what you're forbidden to do is bad. What's bad about doing what I'm forbidden to do? Because you're going to be punished. Well, says the child, I'll fix it so nobody knows I did it. Master, you'll be spied on. Then I'll hide. Well, you'll be questioned. I'll lie. You mustn't lie. Why mustn't I lie? Because it's bad to lie. And Rousseau says this is the inevitable circle. Get out of it and the child won't understand you. But it's useful instruction. But he says Locke wouldn't know what to do with this, to really know how you create God and bad. He just says Locke knows that something's wrong in teaching just knowledge. Locke is aware that there's a problem with classical teaching or the Renaissance, and they've got to break out of it. But remember, Locke says in his essay, not just things like, in his Some Thoughts on Education, not just that he thinks, a child could cry. He says that the great skill of a teacher is to get and keep the attention of his scholar. Whilst he has that, he is sure to advance as fast as the learner's abilities will carry him. And without that, all his bustle and pother will be to little or no purpose. So he's got to make the child comprehend the usefulness of what he teaches him. So it's that idea, which is difficult, I think. Is knowledge relevant? Should it be relevant? And I think Locke is going down that road. And again, I do think knowledge should be useful and relevant, but I worry that you miss the abstract. And then just staying on Locke, because in his an essay concerning human understanding, he does say this great phrase, which most people know: let us suppose the mind to be white paper, void of characters, the blank slate, without any ideas. How is it furnished? And he says the answer is experience. Again, most teachers today, I think, have got a lot of sympathy with that. I think I like it, but I've got to say that I always thought of it as a great opportunity for the teacher. The teacher, I always thought, furnishes that blank slate, or teaches to it, makes the child's mind write on it. I love that idea. I don't think that's quite what Locke means. He's trying to say, in a way, you don't need that teacher. You need to learn from experience, or your self-driven idea of how you will get knowledge, or knowledge that is useful. And this is what you see coming out of the Enlightened period, a kind of attack on the teacher in the classical sense, and an attempt to make it useful. But when I first heard the blank slate quote, I took it as an opportunity for me to teach to the mind's blank slate of the child, but not necessarily saying that that is a completely blank slate. I just think it's a really useful idea that allows the teacher to think, what is it I'm trying to do here? What can I do with it? So for that reason, I like Locke, and I do think when he pushes forward into his ideas on governance from understanding in itself, it does take us somewhere that we need, because you're playing around with what does the child lose, or what freedom is given away in order to let a higher authority come in, which is essentially the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution. We know that mankind is difficult to govern. How much freedom will you take away in order to allow free governance of all? And the idea of tolerance comes in. I think that is a great message which comes out of Locke's later ideas on consent. But I think it does go back to his educational thinking and what it is to have a mind that is genuinely free. But again, probably following where you started today, I worry that we throw away something from the medievals with this shared understanding they had of what knowledge was, in order to come up with the more modern and utilitarian approach to the teacher. They seem to be a bit more throwaway. And I don't want to throw away the knowledge, but I worry that in the Enlightenment period, you're beginning to throw away the teacher, and you see words like preceptor, governor, tutelage. They're all kind of ways of avoiding saying you need a teacher. And I want to try and get the teacher back in without throwing away the knowledge that is gained in this period. But it's a brilliant period of time for knowledge.
I think you've kind of summed it up.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything else on that?
No, I've probably gone on,
yeah,
as usual, very, very long and covered quite a lot of ground. But I suppose in the next period we'll look at how the Victorians tried to bring this teacher back, who potentially got lost or got thrown away. Or I might be wrong, the teacher didn't get thrown away, because that teacher maybe is Newton. Maybe it's Locke. We've got to rethink what we mean by the teacher and the knowledge that is involved, and maybe that is the key to re-enlightening the idea of the teacher. And that may be something that's there already, or we haven't quite seen it yet, but I think it's something that's worth playing around with.
And given that you've already mentioned Gradgrind in Dickens's Hard Times,
yeah,
and you've at several points today referred to didacticism,
yeah,
I do think we're going to have to clear this one up in terms of what you think the limits are of didacticism.
Yeah, and I think when we come to do that, I'm sure, well, again, one of the things that's come out of these sessions is perhaps we get a completely different picture at the end of what the key items are at stake when we talk about the idea of the teacher. And it may be that the didactic element is needed, but not didacticism or not dogma. So something like that. I mean, I sense a tremendous need for the teacher today to have a bit of personality and to be a bit off message, but to know their stuff. And that is something that the Enlightened is trying to, is kicking at in the Renaissance, I suppose. Maybe this artificiality, in the rebirth of the Renaissance, there was a sense of artificiality coming in, and in some ways it was civilizing, but in some ways it was mannerism kind of fake. And yeah, everything's to play for, I suppose, if we see this. If maybe these sessions are an apology for the teacher in the Socratic sense, and that might be a way to consider what we're doing.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Mark Taylor. Thank you.